There is a moment, just before dawn, when the world is still. The river moves in the dark, slow and heavy, carrying silt from mountains you will never see. You are standing on the bank of the Euphrates, somewhere in what we now call southern Iraq. And the year, as best as we can reconstruct it, is roughly 3,900 BC. The air is warm, even at this hour. It clings to your skin with the kind of humidity that never quite lifts in the river lowlands. Beneath your feet, the ground is soft, a mixture of clay, decomposed reeds, and the faint residue of last season's flood. You can smell the water before you see it, that mineral-rich, slightly vegetal scent of a river that feeds everything and threatens everything in equal measure. Somewhere behind you, a cluster of mud brick houses sits low against the plain. Smoke from a dung fire rises from one of them. A dog barks, and in the reeds along the riverbank, something moves. A bird, perhaps, or a fish turning in the shallows. This is home for the people who live here. This is the entire world. We are standing at the threshold of one of the most important transitions in human history. By 3900 BC, communities across Mesopotamia had been settling near rivers for well over 1,000 years. But something was changing. The small agricultural villages of the Ubaid period were beginning to grow, to consolidate, to develop the first signs of what would eventually become urban life. The settlement at Eridu, so long regarded by the Sumerians themselves as the oldest city in the world, had already been occupied for centuries. Tel El Ubaid, Ur, Uruk. These places were no longer just clusters of reed huts. They were becoming something new, something that had never existed before. Permanent communities built around the deliberate management of water. And water, more than any other single force, was the reason these settlements existed at all, and it was also the reason so many of their inhabitants suffered and died. Ancient texts preserve a memory of this period that is remarkable in its intensity. The Sumerian king list speaks of kingship descending from heaven to Eridu, as if the very idea of organized human life began at the edge of a river. The book of Genesis places the cradle of civilization between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a garden watered by rivers that branched into 4 streams. The book of Enoch, uncomposed centuries later, but drawing on traditions that reach deep into Mesopotamian memory, describes a world before the Great Flood, where beings called the Watchers descended and shared forbidden knowledge with humanity. Knowledge of metalwork, agriculture, and the reading of the stars. Whether we read these accounts as theology, as allegory, or as cultural memory attempting to explain the astonishing speed of early technological development, they all point to the same truth. But water was the origin. Water was the gift. And water, when it turned against those who depended on it, was the destroyer. To understand why water mattered so profoundly, you have to understand what southern Mesopotamia actually looked like in the late 4th millennium BC. This was not a lush paradise. Paleoclimatic data tells us that by 3,900 BC, the region was experiencing the tail end of a long arid phase that had begun centuries earlier. Rainfall in the southern alluvial plain was minimal, perhaps 100 to 200 millimeters per year, nowhere near enough to sustain agriculture. Without the rivers, nothing could grow here. The landscape was flat, treeless in most places, scorched by a sun that could push temperatures well above 40 degrees in summer. The soil itself was extraordinarily fertile, thick with the nutrients deposited by millennia of river flooding, but it was useless without irrigation. Everything depended on the ability to move water from the river to the field, and from the field to the mouth. This is where the genius and the misery of early settlement converge. The people living along the Euphrates and its tributaries had developed, through generations of trial and adaptation, a system of canals and ditches that could redirect river water into their fields. Archaeological surveys of the region around Uruk and Eridu have revealed traces of these early canal systems, shallow channels cut into the alluvial clay, sometimes lined with reed bundles to prevent collapse, branching outward from the main river course like the veins of a leaf. These were not grand engineering projects. They were practical, immediate responses to the need for water, dug by hand, maintained by communal labor, and constantly threatened by the very river they were designed to tame. A shift in the river's course could render an entire canal network useless overnight. A heavier than expected flood could destroy months of work in hours. But the canals did more than water crops. They shaped the entire pattern of human settlement. People did not scatter randomly across the plain. They clustered along the channels, building their homes within walking distance of the water source, arranging their fields in narrow strips that followed the flow of irrigation. Archaeological site distribution maps for this period show exactly this pattern, on settlements strung along watercourses like beads on a thread, with empty, uninhabited desert between them. Where the water went, people followed. Where the water failed, people left. It was that simple and that brutal. Now imagine walking through one of these settlements in the early morning, as the sky begins to lighten from black to a pale, dusty gray. The houses are built from sun-dried mud brick, rectangular, low-roofed, with walls about 30 centimeters thick. Some of the older structures use a combination of reed bundles and packed clay, a building technique that stretches back to the earliest Ubaid settlements. The floors are beaten earth, sometimes covered with reed matting. There are no windows in the modern sense, just narrow openings near the roof line to let smoke escape. The interiors are dark, even in daytime, and they carry the accumulated smell of cooking fires, stored grain, animal dung used as fuel, an unhuman habitation in a place without ventilation or drainage. The first task of the day, and the most essential, is water. Someone, usually a woman or an older child, walks to the nearest canal or to the river itself, carrying a ceramic vessel. These vessels are well attested in the archaeological record. Ubaid and early Uruk period pottery includes a range of wide-mouthed jars and narrow-necked containers, clearly designed for carrying and storing liquids. The water they collect is not clean by any standard we would recognize. River water in the Mesopotamian lowlands carries suspended silt, organic material, and, critically, the waste products of every settlement upstream. Parasitological studies of ancient coprolites from Mesopotamian sites have identified eggs of roundworm, whipworm, and tapeworm, all of which are transmitted through contaminated water. Drinking this water was a daily act of survival that was also, unknowingly, a daily act of risk. There was no concept of waterborne disease in the modern sense. The people of 3900 BC did not understand germ theory, but they were not ignorant of the consequences. Ancient Mesopotamian medical texts from later periods, which almost certainly reflect much older oral traditions, describe symptoms that align closely with dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and parasitic infections. And the Akkadian term for certain stomach ailments was associated with the arf, hand of the god, a phrase that reveals how illness was understood in this world. It was not random. It was purposeful. Something, whether divine will, demonic interference, or spiritual transgression, had caused the sickness. The response was not sanitation, but ritual. Not filtration, but prayer and incantation. And yet, despite this, there is evidence that some communities did develop practical methods of water management that, whether by design or by accident, reduced contamination, settling ponds where water was left to stand so that heavier particles could sink, have been identified at several early sites. Storing water in ceramic vessels with narrow necks limited exposure to airborne contaminants. These were not conscious public health measures. They were habits, traditions, and small inherited practices that worked without anyone fully understanding why. Food preparation was intimately tied to water as well. The staple crops of this period, barley and emmer wheat, required processing that involved soaking, grinding, and cooking, all of which demanded water. Bread was baked in simple clay ovens called tanners, a design so effective that it is still used across the Middle East today. Beer, one of the defining innovations of Mesopotamian culture, Anastas was brewed from fermented barley bread. And the fermentation process itself may have made the water used in brewing marginally safer to drink than raw river water. There is a quiet irony in this. One of the earliest and most widespread beverages in human history may have owed its popularity not just to its intoxicating effects, but to the simple fact that it was less likely to make you ill than the water it was made from. The river also brought destruction, so flooding in southern Mesopotamia was not the gentle, predictable seasonal event that the Nile provided for Egypt. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded in spring, driven by snowmelt in the Taurus and Zagros mountains, and the timing and severity of these floods were unpredictable. A bad flood could inundate fields, destroy mud brick houses, contaminate stored grain, and drown livestock and people alike. Geological evidence from sites across the region shows repeated flood layers, thick bands of sterile silt deposited by sudden inundations, interspersed with occupation layers. At Shurupak, later identified in Sumerian tradition as the home of the flood hero Ziusudra, excavations revealed a substantial flood deposit dating to the early 3rd millennium, though similar deposits at other sites suggest that catastrophic flooding was a recurring feature of life in the lowlands for millennia before that. And it is impossible to discuss these flood layers without acknowledging the enormous weight of tradition that surrounds them. The Sumerian flood narrative, the Akkadian epic of Atrahasis, the later epic of Gilgamesh, and the biblical account of Noah all describe a world destroyed by water, a world that had grown wicked or chaotic, or simply too loud for the gods to bear. The Book of Enoch places this destruction in the context of the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, whose violence and corruption made the flood necessary. These are not historical records in the modern sense, but they are cultural memories, shaped and reshaped over thousands of years, that preserve a genuine experience of catastrophic flooding in a landscape where water was both the source of life and the instrument of annihilation. The people who told these stories had watched their world be swallowed by water. They had rebuilt on the same mud, beside the same rivers, knowing it could happen again. That knowledge shaped everything: their architecture, their religion, their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that could be taken away. As the day wears on and the heat becomes oppressive, life in the settlement contracts. People retreat into the shade of their houses or work under temporary reed shelters. Children play near the canals, which are also where animals drink, where clothes are washed, and where human waste inevitably accumulates. The absence of any organized sewage system in settlements of this period is confirmed by archaeological evidence. Waste was deposited in pits, in middens at the edge of the settlement, or simply in the streets and open areas between houses. The smell would have been constant, a thick, organic presence that blended with the odors of cooking, livestock, and the river itself. Flies were everywhere. Disease was everywhere. Infant mortality in pre-urban Mesopotamian communities is estimated to have been staggeringly high, perhaps 40 to 50% of children dying before the age of 5, based on skeletal analysis from burial sites of the period. And yet people stayed. They stayed because the river, for all its dangers, made life possible in a place where nothing else could. The Euphrates and its canals turned barren clay into fields of barley. They provided fish, waterfowl, and reeds for building. They connected settlements to one another, allowing the movement of goods, ideas, and people along waterways that served as the earliest highways. Trade networks of this period show the movement of obsidian, bitumen, copper, and decorated pottery across hundreds of kilometers. And water was the medium through which much of this exchange occurred. A settlement without access to a watercourse was not just inconvenient, it was non-viable. By 3900 BC, the larger settlements in the Uruk hinterland were beginning to develop the social complexity that would, within a few centuries, produce the world's first true cities. The management of water, the digging and maintenance of canals, the allocation of irrigated land, the storage and distribution of grain grown with river water. All of these required coordination, authority, and record-keeping. Some scholars argue that the very origins of administrative bureaucracy, and perhaps of writing itself, can be traced to the need to manage water and the agricultural surplus it created. The clay tokens and early accounting devices studied by Denise Schmont-Besserat, which predate cuneiform by centuries, may have been used to track exactly these kinds of transactions. Water did not just sustain life, it organized it. If you were to visit southern Iraq today, you would find the rivers still there, though diminished by modern dams and irrigation projects upstream. The landscape is still flat, is still hot, still defined by the presence or absence of water. At Eridu, now called Tel Abu Shahrain, the ruins of what the Sumerians considered the first city lie exposed to the desert wind, a low mound of eroded mud brick surrounded by emptiness. The temple platform at its center was rebuilt and expanded over millennia, each generation raising the foundation a little higher, a little farther from the floodwaters. It is a monument not to power, but to persistence, to the human decision, repeated over and over across thousands of years, to stay beside the water despite everything it could do. We will never know the names of the people who dug the first canals, who carried the first jars of river water back to their families, who watched the floods rise and chose to rebuild rather than leave. Their bones lie in shallow graves beneath the alluvial clay, their stories preserved only in the faintest traces of charcoal, pottery, and worn stone tools. But what they built, the understanding that water could be managed, directed, shared, and fought over, became the foundation of everything that followed. Every city, every empire, every civilization that rose in this part of the world did so because someone, once, figured out how to bring the river to the field. That is the world of the Nephilim. Not a world of giants and fallen angels, though those stories carry their own deep truth, but a world of human beings standing at the edge of a river in the dark, knowing that the water could save them or destroy them, and choosing every single morning to stay. If there is something you would like us to explore next, another era, another mystery, another lost world waiting to be reconstructed, let us know. We will meet you there.